So, lately, as in for like the last year, we start off with a little meditation or something that starts to prime the pump and get you thinking about or feeling about what our message is today. Usually it's something where we close our eyes and we visualize a little or meditate a little. And today I read this email that I got this morning, and then when I sat down, my wife said to me, "Well, who sent you that email this morning? Why, like, how did someone know you were doing a talk on vulnerability?" And then I said, "Well, it was in the newsletter, you know." And then she said, "No, who sent you the email?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, I sent it to myself." Because I was driving and I couldn't write down what I was thinking, so I don't know, does that count? I got it. I mean, it's an email. And honestly, when I got here and I read it, it was really as if I read it for the first time. And then with the spell correction, you know, I mean, it said all kinds of weird and perverted things. So anyway, vulnerability. It's our first topic in the series on love because really I think it's one of the first sticking points of love. And I remember that in particular because when I first came here, actually, we did a few more groups and programs in the evenings around relationships and romantic love and things like that. And one of the biggest issues that people would talk about and share was their struggle knowing how to love and when to love and who to love, which I found so confusing. And so I asked, tell me more, say something else about that. And of course, people would always share in the same kind of way. Well, I shared my heart, but then it was broken. I gave my heart, but then it was taken. I trusted, but then my trust was betrayed. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I know when it is exactly, precisely correct and safe to love completely so I don't get hurt? And I thought, well, you're in trouble. And it's normal and natural because that's how many of us have been groomed. To look for the very special conditions in which we can love fully and openly and not be hurt. It's the Prince Charming story, and it's finding your church story, and it's your team wins story. It's the condition in which everything goes your way, and then you open up and live happily ever after. Has anyone seen that in real life? No hurt, perfect safety forever? Like not even a funny look that made you feel bad? This is a hard place to love, to keep the heart open, but here's the secret and why we begin with vulnerability. Because the strongest place to love from is the place that's unconditional. If you give your heart openly to everyone, then no one can break it. If you give your heart generously all the time, in all conditions, then there is no condition that can deplete your heart. Because it grows, it amplifies, and it comes from a place that is deeper than the place that wants something. It comes from a place that's deeper than the place that needs something. It comes from the place that already has it. And from that place, with that kind of love, then all the struggles and challenges can come and go, and sure, they'll hurt from time to time. But we will never be stuck asking the question, who and when and where, or even why. These are not appropriate questions for the fundamental condition of the universe, which is loving. So, I was thinking about vulnerability or contemplating would be a better word, right? I was contemplating vulnerability. And what I found myself thinking about was how much I once loved working in hospitals at the bedside of dying people. I don't know why I thought that at first, but that's what I thought about. And I thought, isn't it interesting that that was probably one of the most rewarding times of my life, one of the most powerful experiences, to be with people as they transition out, to be with their families as they transition onward. It's kind of an awful thing for most people, hanging out with death. And I was thinking, why was it such a beautiful time? Why is it such a beautiful place to be there so close to the edge? And I realized it's because everyone's so vulnerable. The people preparing to pass are in a state of ultimate vulnerability. There's really nothing left to hang on to, no matter what they say or do or try. If they're at the threshold and the door is open, we know. We don't even have to speak it, that the ultimate vulnerability is at hand. And the same is true for the family members who come and go, and for those who don't, because they're afraid to step in to that energy of vulnerability. Too busy with work this week, had to make a trip out of town. I'm sure they won't go before I get back. I probably should write that letter. I should probably make that call, but, and it doesn't happen because it's too vulnerable, it's too scary, too much pain. But when you step into the vulnerability, and I know that many of you have had this experience, and you're willing to keep your heart open with someone at the edge of life, someone in the most vulnerable moment of all, when you do that with an open mind and an open heart, you find the most extraordinary power. You know God is real. You feel Spirit in the room, in yourself, between you. You connect amazingly in that most fragile moment of all with the awareness of that which is invincible, that which never ends, that which never dies. You feel a kind of immortality, the taste of Spirit in those precious moments. And for those of us that have been at that bedside, there's something very hard to talk about later, which is that you miss that space. You miss that vulnerability. I was about 22 when my dad died, and I have to say, being at his bedside in his final month was the sweetest, most incredible time I ever had with him. And the only thing I could have wished for myself is that it had gone on longer. But that would have been terrible too. So let's shift gears a little bit, because if being vulnerable is so great, why is it the source of so much chaos? I mean, really, it's kind of the source of all chaos, isn't it? The drive for security, for control, for protection, for insulation and defense, all arises from the perception of vulnerability. So let's talk for a moment before we continue to celebrate, how much we want to embrace it. What do you do with the pain of it? Because that's real. That's real. Where does it come from? Well, I tend to think that we are like, this isn't very pretty, but I think we're like energetic onions. That we've got these layers and layers and layers of energy. And each energy kind of have its own consciousness and organization and intelligence. And the outermost layers are very much the layers of what we call the ego, or the externalized self, the self I present to the world. And below it are all those other layers, our wounds and our truest self. And when we're vulnerable, that hard outer shell is in jeopardy. Or maybe it's even been stripped away by someone's terrible choice, or difficult decision, or a hard action, or something that strikes so hard at the world we tried to create that vulnerable is the only thing left to feel, and it's painful. It's painful where that crack is struck. The energy of so much history flows. Fear, trauma, uncertainty, loss of identity, who we thought we were, how we thought things were going to be. And what do you do? What do you do when things change and vulnerability arises? The first, hopefully after today, is that you remember, oh, wait, this is not to be feared. I heard that somewhere, right? Just try to remember that. Someone sent himself an email about this. So you start by just accepting it. As David White wrote and Bruce beautifully read, it is the precondition of life. We are vulnerable. And the harder you fight against that, the more energy you waste and the more vulnerable you become. So accept it. Okay, here it is. I didn't expect this change. I didn't expect that decision. I didn't expect this experience. And now I'm in it. And then what comes after accepting, just acknowledging that it's true, as opposed to denying it, is to feel it. What is it? What is it that you're feeling when you're vulnerable? Usually it's so ugly and painful that we just turn away and we don't even allow ourselves to feel it fully. But it has so much to say. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's sadness. Maybe it's a memory. Maybe it's asking you to do something different or be something different. But if you don't listen, if you don't feel, then the lessons can't come. So we accept it, and then we let ourselves feel it. Wow, this is harsh. Wow, this is scary. Wow, this is sad. And what is it telling me? What is it teaching me about the universe? Or more often about myself? More often about myself. And then finally, we go from accepting it to feeling it, to learning from it, to living from it. And what does that look like in a relationship? What does that look like on a work team or in the world? It means we name it and say, wow, I'm feeling vulnerable. Look at what's going on. I'm feeling vulnerable in your presence when you do this, when you do that, as these things happen. And then you ask the question, and how is it for you? Where are you in this? And the miracle, because that sounds so ridiculous, it's easy to say, right? But who wants to be that vulnerable person? Exposing ourselves, naming it, and inviting the very people, places, or things to respond. It's almost illogical because the very vulnerable feeling indicates we don't trust them. We don't trust them. But if you ask, and if you open your heart and mind, you know what you'll find most of the time? Is that vulnerability is the response. Vulnerability is the response. That's how you end a war in yourself, in your family, or the world. You say, tell me your story, and I'll listen. How did you get so hurt that this happened? And you listen. You show the very essence of who you are. And most of the time, that is what will respond to you. Now, not 100% of the time, but nothing's perfect in this dimension. And so we move to the final lessons, the final realization, which is that sure, we can become more skillful as we face those vulnerable moments, but we can go beyond that still and choose to be vulnerable. Look for ways to be vulnerable. Live vulnerably. And what does that really mean? Well, it's a trick. It's a trick. It's a trick. And the trick is this, that as you consciously accept vulnerability as a path, you are faced to recognize a simple truth that removes all the pain and struggle of vulnerability. And that is that we are only in relationship to ourselves. We are only in relationship to Spirit. It's one thing. It's one thing in a dynamic expression, like a symphony or a concert, but it's one thing, one song, playing itself over time. And as we start to see each person, each situation, each choice as Spirit, then vulnerability falls away, because it's an expression of division. It's an expression of separateness. And so as we claim connection, 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 as we affirm love, 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 in all its shades, then suddenly life is very different. And vulnerability becomes sweet and something to savor and the source of our greatest power. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a moment and just reflect, if you can, on a situation in your life right now where you feel vulnerable. And maybe you haven't even named it that. Maybe you just call it being offended or upset or confused. But take a look and see or feel how that might really be the experience of vulnerability. And ask yourself if you can move into it with acceptance, by feeling, by learning, and then living as if what we claim were really true. That all is one. That life and all that is beyond life is Spirit. And that we are a brief, magnificent, mysterious expression of it. And that in that great mystery, that great confusion, vulnerability just might bring us to the only things we can really hold on to. Love, faith, and each other.